Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for showing up tonight for this very special read along discussion video that we have planned for everyone that joined Seth and I on our read along of Blood Standard by Laird Barron. We had so much fun. We were just telling Laird that the Goodreads chat has been one of the liveliest and one of the most fun Goodreads chat for a read along that I've ever been a part of. Everybody has had so much to say. People stayed on track reading the book. Nobody dipped out. Everybody that joined has been a part of the whole discussion, and it's really been so much fun. So to cap that energy off, we asked Laird to join us for an Ask Me Anything discussion video. And Laird, it is so nice to have you here tonight.
Thank you for having me here. I want to thank you too for hosting this and doing this project, and also everybody who's participated. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we are so thankful to have you here. Also with joining me is the Hartmann and Humble show, Seth. Yes, Humble. Seth is an author, and he has written several books and some short stories.
Mm-hmm.
And he is going to have a book out in the world coming very shortly in April. And Laird, you actually blurbed it, didn't you?
I did. I'm a big fan of Seth's for a long time now.
I am also a big fan. So the crowd hanging out in the chat will know Seth's name by the end of the year. That is a fact.
I hope so. I hope everyone across the world eventually knows and buys both Laird and I's books.
Yes, that's the goal.
That's the goal.
So we went ahead and we read Blood Standard, which is part of the Isaiah Coleridge series. Thank you. Yes. And this is my first experience reading Laird's novels. I've read a couple of short stories that I've absolutely loved. And I just kind of prophesied on Twitter that I was going to be a big Laird Barron fan this year. So I'm going to be going through many of Laird's books. But Seth, you are already a fan.
I'm a huge fan of Laird's. I came across his work, I would say probably 7 years ago. It started for me with Frontier Death Song, which came about through Nightmare Magazine, or I guess Nightmare, where they had the audiobook version. I want to say that was done by Stephen Rudnicki, that introduced me to Laird's work. That was really tremendous. Stephen did an incredible job of encapsulating the sort of gruff roughness that Laird has provided, especially about Alaska in his career. So that was a tremendous story. And then I just started diving into occultation, the beautiful thing that awaits us all, the Croning, which for me, and I'm just going to go ahead and say this now because I've been waiting to say it, has probably my favorite prologue of any dark fantasy book that I've ever read. It is a tremendous book. I think everybody should pick it up. So I'm an enormous fan of Laird's, and I think after we get done with talking about Blood Standard and all of Laird's triumphant books through his career, that everyone's going to be a fan too. It's really a tremendous body of work, and he's still in his prime, still working hard. Not anywhere close to death is what I'm trying to say here for Laird. He's still crushing it.
Another prophecy.
Making sure the Reaper's not sneak up behind me. I don't want to interrupt, but I do have to correct one thing. Rudnicki actually has done quite a few stories, and I love his work. Mm-hmm. That was actually, if I'm not mistaken, Dave, and I'll probably pronounce this incorrectly, but Dave Robeson.
That is Dave Robeson. Yeah.
Robeson, right?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Just absolutely nailed it.
Mm-hmm.
I thought. But outside of that, thanks.
Of course.
Yeah, and the cool thing about this read along too is that everybody came to this book with different experiences. So some people had already read the entire series and just wanted to read it again. Some people were reading it for the first time, like me. Some people have read a lot of your work, or this was the first time, and they're all hanging out in the chat. So I did want to let them know that please make sure that if you have a burning question for Laird, you can just put it in there at any time, and we're going to be keeping an eye on it so that we can ask those questions for you. I can also pop things up on here to highlight it. And there's a Seth talking about his book that's coming in April from Perpetual Motion Machine. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Seth, for the first question.
Right. And I appreciate that. Thank you again, Sadie Hartmann, Mother Horror, to whom we are all indebted for bringing us together. This was her idea, and I'm really appreciative that I'm along for the ride. I wanted to start off with a question for you, Laird. It's a question I think that after reading Blood Standard, a question I think a lot of our audience will have, and that question is, who is Isaiah Coleridge? Where does he come from?
Very good. Before I answer that, I just want to respond. Hello to Pearl the Husky. So I want to get the important things taken care of first.
Absolutely.
He loves Paul. Paul's a great reader.
So, basically Coleridge, in the simplest terms, and he evolved over the course of the 3 books I've written, and I'm writing short fiction about him and Lionel as well. I've lived with them for about 8 years now, and over 3 novels. That's around 300, well, close to 300,000 words, including some of the short fiction that I haven't published concerning them yet. That's a lot to have lived with, a couple characters. At least for me, most of my characters are you might see them in passing again, but very few series characters. Jessica Mace is the only one that's like a constantly recurring character. So they've changed in my mind, but also sort of almost externally, they've changed over the course of the last few years. But initially, Coleridge was a synthesis of all the tough guy characters that I had worked with over the years. I had my Yakuza enforcer and my Irish mobster, and sort of fly-by-night leg breakers and effete spies, etc., and so forth. There's Light as a Darkness. There's Conrad Navarro, who's actually a superhuman character. And what I sort of got the feeling, it's like any topic, whether it's love, mystery, crime, this case, hard-boiled characters, that you never really will plumb the depths of them if you think about them, if you break them up into different categories. I was very fascinated with Japanese and other Asian horror back in the early aughts, and that informed some of my early fiction as well. How a tough guy in Japanese cinema is so different, very often is so different from typical Hollywood depictions of a similar type of character. There's a lot of crossover, but there are these distinct differences. I noticed that in Japan and Korea, places like that, they're not afraid of allowing the tough guy to cry, to show anger, or to be ineffectual, but not for comedic relief, although they do that as well. But just they're multifaceted in a way that you don't always get in popular fiction or cinema in the West. So when I created Coleridge, one of the main factors, I want to do the best that I can at the time of taking everything that I had sort of tried to perfect over the years, say, all right, what's a quintessential sort of embodiment of all these different types of characters, and create this, I want to say a super character, but like sort of an alloy of all these characters that has different facets, and then write a straightforward crime novel about this character. And the other part of that question is but why Isaiah? And he went through different names, initially he was just going to be a big Irish guy. There was just all these different things that I played with, but he was the one who showed up for the job. Several characters auditioned. I dreamt about, I planned it for quite a while, at least a year. I wrote a few paragraphs. I had a sketchy idea in my mind of what I was going to do, but none of it was all fine, but none of it felt right. And then when he showed up, I said, yeah, this is the character.
I love that. I love that you said different characters auditioned, like, and also that one thing that you kept in there that really spoke to my context of noir and just watching a lot of black and white movies and Humphrey Bogart, which I see peeking around over your shoulder back there. Just those witty lines, like just those one-liners where, like, you know, somebody will say, "Ooh, curtains, baby," or something, you know, calling people sugar and stuff, like all that is in there. It's infused into this story, and I really appreciated that. So do you have any favorite like black and white movies that you contextualize that way?
You know, not in, I mean, I like all kinds of cinema, and I do like noir. Double Indemnity is one of my favorites, but it doesn't really fit. The film version doesn't necessarily track to what I'm doing. But then again, I don't read as much horror as I do anything else. Horror is probably the smallest when I'm not reading for, because I've read for the Shirleys and, you know, other things. And so if I'm reading for an award or I'm blurbing people's stuff or reading to blurb, then yes, I read a lot of horror in that regard. But for entertainment, I have a tendency, as much as I love horror, and I do, to read a much greater volume over my life of Westerns and fantasy and science fiction and crime and noir. And that would probably would be the lion's share of everything I've ever read, would be thrillers, mysteries, crime, noir, what have you. But one way that Double Indemnity does fit in, it would be the literary version, which really veers. I don't want to spoil it, but it's much more horrific. The last bit of it is so much closer to a horror novel than even a lot of horror novels are. So that had an influence on me. But you know, the thing is though, is that even though there's a certain similarity between, there's things from my life that I went ahead and infused into Coleridge's out of convenience. I had just moved to New York, not directly from Alaska, and so it was just really simple. Since I'm learning New York State, it's just way easier to have him be learning New York State. And we both have similar loves in literature and things like that. But you know, it was conceived as being a straightforward crime, or, you know, fusion of various genres, but very straightforward traditional novel, just my take on it. And so, you know, I have to say that it was probably only the third novel I've ever attempted. And so I felt like I was learning a lot, not about the culture or the literature or the conventions, but how to do it myself. And so I erred on the side of really trying to layer in things that would make longtime readers of that kind of fiction comfortable. And then as the series goes on, I discard that worry or that consideration to some degree.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get in here. We have a comment by Spencer Ruiz, who said, I love the personal intimacy that was involved in Isaiah's relationship with those he meets. He's a macho, but not a toxic macho. So Laird, when you're developing a character like Isaiah, what are the considerations that you take into mind when you're saying, I want this person to be this, and I want him to have this? Or was this more an organic development of Isaiah told you who he was rather than the other way around?
As John Langan is famous for saying, a little of column A and a little of column B. You can have all the plans. You know this. Plans are great. You should have a plan, but once you make contact with the project, that plan is probably it's not going to survive, and it won't survive the procedure and come out the other end looking like as you had hoped, or maybe it'd be better. But so it's a little of both. In some ways, the Coleridge project was simpler for me than most of my fiction, because it's sort of a distillation of things that I normally can get away with when I write short fiction and the stakes are lower. I'm one of 20 authors. I can just go batshit crazy with a story, and either people will say, "Hey, that's wonderful," or just as, or more likely they'll go, well, next, Joe Hill's got a story, or so, you know, Stephen King's got a story. Let's try that. But when you're writing a commercial novel, the stakes are different, and I really wanted to broaden my readership at the time. That was part of the entire goal. And so it was simple in the sense that, okay, I'm going to write it with an eye toward accessibility, not necessarily dumbing it down. Anything I don't, because unfortunately it kind of turned out that it's too literary for a beach read, but not literary enough to be a literary novel. It's one of those, deals. But it certainly is a lot more accessible than my typical short story. There's only a handful of short stories, I think, that probably Frontier Death Song, as you mentioned earlier, would be something that would fit in. You just read it, it is what it seems to be.
Right.
Where it gets more complicated, though, for me, is that I only wanted to compromise, not completely abdicate my artistic sensibilities. And so Coleridge is more nuanced than maybe he would be if I'd gone full tilt for a commercial beach read. Less nuanced than somebody like Jessica Mace, where you might have to read a short story twice to understand or to catch some of the things that I was doing. But Coleridge is sort of like in that middle ground. I wanted him to be nuanced enough that I enjoyed writing him, that I would discover new things over the course of however many books, and stories that we're going to be together, but not so nuanced that it's literary angst. So it's
Right.
really, there's a balancing of fan service or cliche or convention, whatever your tradition. These are the things that you expect from a novel like this. The quipping, things are going to be generally okay, but maybe over here I'm taking away. Maybe there's going to be something that might come back to haunt you. There's other ways besides killing somebody to damage a character. And so there's this tension between the two, where if I had just put my feet firmly in one ground or the other, outside of the line or the other, it would have been simpler.
Right. It's tremendous insight on the character creation. I love that. All of us, all the reader nerds are like, oh, this is how Isaiah came into being.
And we're also excited about the evolution of his character, like just knowing that, Laird said that there's just going to be this like room for growth and, room for him to learn more about Isaiah as he goes. Like, I mean, right off the get-go, just the fact that Isaiah throws around, terminology like, I'm not afraid of fear, like, or I'm not afraid of violence, like that. It just gives this like dynamic to Isaiah that is so unsettling. Like, you're just not sure what he's going to do in a given situation that's going to incite violence, which is the whole tension, for readers. Like, I don't necessarily want to see him get his ass kicked, but I mean, that's what he feels like suits
Right.
the purpose.
And it happens a lot in the novel.
Yeah, it sure does.
Right. And for me, what's interesting isn't the particular, and obviously we're discussing, you guys have read that novel, so we can't get into the others, but when I found out I was going to be able to do at least 3, it allowed me to, and it takes place over the course of several years, but so not a huge time period, but like, I'm trying to remember, I think it's about 4 years, 5 years, and you get to see consequences. But once again, consequences within the framework of, it's almost like a meta acknowledgement of what we're dealing with here. This is not a literary series in the sense of, yep, just in the middle of it, I'm going to kill him, and then Robard's going to take over, and one of those deals.
Right.
You're not going to get something like that.
Good.
But the bottom line is, and I don't think that spoils anything. It is what it is. This is me taking a commercial. When I sold this to Putnam, I didn't necessarily make a blood oath, but it's essentially the vow of, you're going to at least keep this within certain, maybe it's a vow that I more made to myself. I don't know if anybody actually kept that little piece of paper I put my thumbprint on, but that I was going to play with the convention, not necessarily try to, as I do with a lot of my short fiction. I've always written crime. It's just that I invert it, or I pervert it, or deform it and do things with it. But this, I wanted to just prod it a little bit, but in a loving way. That's something else I'd like to make clear, is that it's, whatever I do with crime, the conventions of the various genres that I work in.
Mm-hmm.
Even if I seem, and I am acerbic, but I have respect for writing in general. There's things that I enjoy more and that I'm better at,
Mm-hmm.
but that doesn't mean, just because I don't write romance doesn't mean that I don't appreciate romance.
Sure.
And you get right. And so when I'm doing something in a story, I mean, this is my opportunity to say, hey, look, you can interpret my writing however you please, but my tongue may be in my cheek, but I'm not mocking. I'm never mocking the source material. If anything, I'm mocking. I'm being a little bit arch toward myself. And before we go any further, you mentioned bogey. That actually, I want to give credit to Jessica M. That's her poster, and she graciously allowed me to install him. And frankly, this goes into the topic of choosing titles for commercial fiction. It's not the same. Generally speaking, when I come up with a title for a story or a small press book or something like that, there's not much. It's like, hey, is that what you want to call it? That's fine. There's a committee at PodDub. You don't just walk in and say, okay, here's what it's called. They'll go, yeah, what are your other 30 options?
Oh, wow.
And so for each book, I had at least around 24 options that I could kind of live with, some more than others.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason that I picked Worse Angels for the third book as one of the
Spoiler alert! Spoiler alert! Just kidding. Go ahead.
No, it's not a spoiler. It's okay. No, but it was because of him over my shoulder. It's obviously a play on Lincoln's famous, our
right, the Better Angels by Nature.
Angels. And I couldn't believe that no one had ever used Worse Angels. Everybody has been tilling the soil for decades, and I cannot find an example of Worse Angels. Angels, but not necessarily, Worse Angels. But Bogey is, and Jessica M. by extension is sort of responsible for that, because every time I'd be on a podcast or something, I'd look up and I'd see him, or I'd turn around and he's over my shoulder.
That's great.
Right.
I mean, Angels with Dirty Souls, that's what.
Right. Angels with Dirty Souls.
Right.
So Jessica M., whom the novel is dedicated, which we want to throw that out there. Jessica M., thank you so much for inspiring Laird to bring us this wonderful character. So one of the things that is interesting, or that I wanted to ask, and everyone, if you're in the chat, don't worry, I'm going to get to your questions. But I'm a fanboy, so I'm going to ask my questions first. So this one was a particular interest to me, and it's in a lot of your work. Mythology is pervasive throughout all of your work. It's very important to you, from varying religions, different parts of the world. Fans of yours will have seen it in it's shot all through everything that you've done. And Isaiah is particularly interested in talking about mythology and even internalizing the story to a point where it feels like he is telling us about a personal mythology that he is a part of. Can you walk us through that a little bit and say, and discuss maybe, why is Isaiah so interested in having us hear about his story in these mythological terms? I mean, we have references to Achilles, Odysseus, especially with his relationship with Meg, in the dream sequence that she has. Why is mythology important to Isaiah?
It's important to me. I think it's important to all of us to some degree, even if you reject it or aren't conscious or cognizant of its influence upon society, civilization. So I felt that was important, but it's just something that interests me, and I don't weave it as much in every story that I write, but I felt like it was a great undergirding for this character to kind of root him. And initially I was thinking smaller. I was thinking, I'll basically have this sort of parallel journey, the 12 labors of Hercules, that's something that it's not just a crime novel. It's not just a mystery, that there's this sort of larger and ancient sort of tradition that's sort of informing it. And I don't think this will be a spoiler because it already sort of happens in the first one, but I abandoned that pretty immediately. I didn't abandon it. I expanded it. I realized, no, he's not Hercules. He is, why wouldn't he be any number of other like Maori heroes, or Beowulf or whomever. And I said, no, it's the hero's journey. And in some ways, it's our idea of the toxic male's heroic journey. I mean, if you look at the journey of Beowulf, the journey of Odysseus, Hercules, all of them, first of all, they're heroes, but heroes by ancient standards and by sort of a claim, by proclamation. A lot of them are completely amoral in there. If you start getting into the actual unsanitized material, they're merciless, they're amoral, they're lecherous, they're all, they usually are brought down because of their own, they cross the wrong woman or the wrong king, the male king or whatever. And so I wanted that, I kind of wanted that in there as a critique. He's sort of critiquing himself in a gentle way. Mm-hmm. But also it was a way for me to, well, yes, I'm playing it straight. One cool thing about, in the sense of it's not a supernatural series, or at least the first, at least it doesn't start out that way, but it, I still wanted to, how should I put this? Crime and mystery, noir, they all can be informed and have been informed by the occult. And very often what will happen is it'll either be a deal with the devil if it's overtly occult, like, oh, the devil's lurking in the background, angel heart or falling angel. Or it's, well, we never explicitly see the devil, but his hand is perhaps in this. And so mythology was a way for me to bring in the numinous. There's a final reason, though, that I really thought was important, at least to me it was important. And that is, a lot of the stuff that I look up to that the genre is sort of founded upon is tarnished knights walking the mean streets. And I love that. But that has been done and been done and been done by better writers than I'll ever be. I wanted to go farther and go, no, I want to go way beyond the tarnished knight. Let's go back to the archetypal heroes. And that's Beowulf and Gilgamesh and on and on, biblical heroes from up, the Mahabharata, whatever, and to take sort of this, I don't want to quite say amoral, but some of that amorality. So, and I thought, what better protagonist than sort of a semi-anti-hero to embody that? Now, he's not a villain. He's perhaps he was before the story begins, but he has now graduated from being just a sort of a cartoonish henchman villain to, and he's definitely larger than life. His capabilities, his, it's men's power fantasy. So there's definitely this sort of fantastical element, even in the mundane things, kind of go the way they're supposed to go. All Lee Child or, Jack Reacher kind of stuff.
Right.
Spencer. I mean, they all live charmed lives. Even when the worst things happen, it's charm. And so I said, all right, let's have him, not necessarily consciously, but that's who he's emulating. He's a shadow of Achilles. He's a shadow of Hercules, etc. And I thought that had been something that you see it in fantasy, but it's not something that I necessarily have seen a gumshoe or an arm breaker modeled after.
Right. I think that it's something that's really unique about this, your crime trilogy is, and for those, so Laird's reference to the Tarnished Knight, he's making a reference to the Raymond Chandler quote where he says, down these mean streets a man must go who he himself is not mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid. He's the hero. He is everything. And that is Raymond Chandler talking about who the gumshoe detective is of the 1930s and 40s. But what's really interesting about your trilogy, Laird, is that you decided at the outset, I don't want to play the detective. I want to play the heavy. And it's great because in the latter chapters of the book, there's a chapter where you specifically have Isaiah say, both out loud and to the audience, he says, I am not a detective.
Yeah.
That is not what I'm here for.
Yeah. Right.
And
I play one, but I'm not one.
Right. I stayed at a Holiday Inn last night, but I'm not a detective. So it's one of the really interesting aspects of the novel for me, like from a plotting perspective, because it does play so heavily like I don't want to say a Chambara film. I know you've talked about the Asian influences on the character and the plotting, but so much of it plays at the outset like a revenge. One of the great, Akira Kurosawa revenge flicks. But then all of a sudden there is this mystery pervasive all throughout the thing where we're looking for this person and we can't find her. And there's this desperation. And so the last thing I'll ask before I start going to everybody's questions is, why is it that, and this is specifically for me to ask, why is it that Isaiah's, his detection skills, they don't seem to evolve the way in the immediate outset of the novel, the way that we start seeing with other characters? When do you feel like is the impetus point where Isaiah realizes I have to start doing real detection rather than just, pounding his way through the underbelly of society?
Right. And I liken it to a superhero origin story. The initial comic run, the first few issues, or if it's a movie, the first movie is always Peter Parker, going, I thought I had a wet dream, but it was just my webbing. This webbing, what is this stuff?
Right.
And falling out of windows. And so obviously he's more accomplished. He's a 40-year-old, 40 something is vague. He's a mature, he has a life behind him, probably 2 or 3 lives compared to the typical person. So, but he's nonetheless, this is an origin story. And so I feel as if he has sort of this incoherent sort of impulse to do this, to do the right thing. He feels like he's maybe caught up in something larger than himself. And so he bulldozes his way through that first book. And I won't say that he ever becomes an accomplished detective, but there is in the second book, once again, I don't think this will hurt anything. There's a lot more. John Langan talked about it. He said, man, he goes, there's a lot more quotidian sort of, you have more interest in the quotidian than a typical detective novel. Procedurals, maybe not. It's closer to procedural in some way. But like right. Spencer, he calls the right people and,
figures things out.
Those are skinny books too, right? They're 60,000 words, maybe the most, some of them, and maybe 70. I don't know. I don't think they're even that long for most of them. But I had never really thought of that. But Spencer doesn't do a lot of brain work. Spencer just he punches a couple people. He points a gun at somebody. He goes, Hawk, what do you think? I think if we point guns at them, they'll start talking, and they do. And right. So in Black Mountain, he's still Coleridge, and there's still horrible things going on. He still has his inclinations, but there is an attempt to become more of to do it the right way.
Right. And that made me want to ask 7 more questions, but I'm going to jump over into the chat if that's okay with you.
Yeah, there are some good questions over there too.
I saw a question, it's a pretty tough question. I think you should go ahead and about the racial slurs. I think that we should go ahead and tackle that.
Yeah. So She Reads with Cats. First off, thank you so much for joining us. We love that you're here. Well, apparently a personal friend of Sadie's. Wonderful. Mm-hmm. She says, I'm not a reader who needs any sort of trigger warnings. I am a reviewer, and I'd love to pick your brain about something. Can you talk about the decision to keep racial slurs in the book?
Right. And it's actually a decision that I consciously made, sort of agonized over. Then obviously my agent saw it. My agent is going to look out for me and make sure that I'm not doing something to, that's inappropriate, right? For my sake or everybody else's. And obviously it went through the team at Putnam. And I hope that I handled it correctly, or as correctly as, a white middle-aged guy can handle something like this. And I felt like I was sort of caught, at least in this book. And I became more savvy as the series goes on, where I don't feel that necessarily, well, his arc kind of takes him away from that being an issue as much. But I really felt like I had to establish, and this is why I left them in, I felt like I had to establish that, while this is a power fantasy and it's a beach read and all this, that I have a mixed race protagonist. There are a diverse group of people, ethnically throughout the story. And we're also talking about, a certain subset of society, gangsters and gang, not just gangsters, but like mafiosos, etc., and police. And I said to myself, okay, do you put this stuff in? Do you go Quentin Tarantino every other word's
Right.
the N word, some epithet?
Uh,
Or do you, I chose to take I want to say middle ground. It's much closer to not. If you count the number of actual slurs in the book, it's probably on the lesser side of the scale than it could have been if I'd gone full tilt. What I was trying to do is the same way that when I'm reading aloud, I don't do patois, I don't do accents, I don't try to feminize my voice, but I do inflect. So like I will do just enough, I hope, that you get the idea, oh, this is a woman talking, or a southerner, or a gangster, or whatever, without becoming a caricature. And I felt like it was necessary for that to be touched upon. And more than that, I felt it was necessary because I would be ducking it if I didn't put it in. Now, I could be entirely incorrect. I'm not making a statement as to whether as a team we should have kept that in there, whether I should have written that. But I felt like this was my reasoning for keeping it in, because it would have been very simple just to excise it. And I even went so far as like, would I read this aloud? And I said no, because there's a big difference between a character in the book uttering a slur, especially certain slurs, and the author. There is no insulation if I'm at a reading. If I wouldn't read it aloud, not because I'm ashamed to have written it, but because I honestly don't feel that it's the same thing.
It's not. Right. I totally agree.
Yeah, I agree too.
I picked William Demerit and I don't want to throw him into this because I don't even know what his opinion about anything is, but he was really supportive of the book in general. He's the narrator for the audio books. I really feel like he is the voice of Coleridge, and this is not to say that I know any of his opinions about this at all. Okay, so we'll preface it with that. But I was worried, because they said, well, here's a different. I had several selections or choices, and I said, number one, it has to be Coleridge. Doesn't have to be, Maori or Samoan, but can't be. Coleridge is not a white guy, so he has to be ethnic. We cannot whitewash him. And so Demerit just absolutely has that cross between kind of a heavy voice. There's heaviness. There's a sinister. He can affect a sinister tone, but also very urbane and very smooth. And I honestly think that he probably would have turned it down, or wouldn't have done the other ones, or would have said something to me if he would have felt that I had crossed a line with what I did. But like I said, that was my reasoning. I was trying to do what I felt was the right thing, not just for the book, but also I felt like once I put my foot in this kind of a narrative, then I had to make some tough choices. And that really was a tough choice.
Right. And I'm only guessing here, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there comes a point where when you jump in to have these, I won't say, it's villainous for them to use to use these racist phrases, but they are clearly people who are of villainous aspect. And except for Bello,
right. And he uses that term but not as a slur, but as a mocking, sarcastic. They're talking about the missing girl, and she's not white, she's not blonde, and he goes, so who cares? Racial slur, who cares? And obviously he does care, even though it's not his case. He's just tied up in it because it crosses federal jurisdiction because of the gangland affiliations and whatnot. But he says, right, you don't think anyone's going to look for her, and you're right, she's not. And of course, I think we've all, seen this. Amber Alerts go out for pretty white girls way more often than anybody else.
Yeah.
And that was, I just felt like it was almost impossible for me to talk about that, whether that's the reality or not. I felt it was impossible to talk about that without just tackling it.
Right. And I think you do a great job, especially when Isaiah is dealing with characters with clearly racist compunctions that right. He refers to himself as he even he mocks their racism, using language to refer to himself, to be like, this is why you're really upset. It's because it's me and I'm not white.
Right.
So I think that's wonderful. I did want to jump over to Paul Preston. Paul, thank you so much for, or I'm sorry, no, not Paul Preston. Paul, we're happy you're here.
Love you, Paul.
We love you, Paul. But I do wanted to jump in here with Ethan Polliard's question, where he says, One of my favorite aspects of the Coleridge novels was the subtle infiltration of the wider Barron mythos into the stories. Will that continue in future novels? ?
Hi, Ethan.
Hi.
Ethan is my in-house designer for Nightworms.
Great.
Welcome aboard, Ethan.
Good to have you. Thanks for the question. Well, right now there's just the three novels, but there will be more novels, but there's certainly going to be novellas and whatnot. And full on. I still have. I'm
What?
not quite sure. Well, I was going to say I still have an idea about. I forget what the terminology is, but basically, in Hollywood, certain types of characters there are rules for, or comics. There's rules for how the characters are, what they can or can't do.
Character Bible.
Right, like whether they can ever be shown blood or whether they're ever allowed to be nude. Would they ever cross? There's certain like almost contractual things. And I won't go that far with him, but let me put it this way. I think that he reacts to my wider universe differently than, say, Jessica Mace or Johnny Cope or somebody else. He might even run into the same thing some of them do, but his takeaway is going to be different. I've already vowed to myself that at least for a while, I don't want him to be conscious of Old Leech or anything like that. You can slap him in the face with it. He's still going to go, okay, it's like a normal person. It's this bizarre wacko cult behavior, or my brain damage is acting up again, whatever. but I will say, this might be pertinent to people who are enjoying Coleridge. I am working on a novel and several long short stories and longer pieces about Robard and Coleridge set in the first chapter of the Croning, that universe. So in other words, it's a universe of talking dogs and murderous kings and fairy tale monsters and they basically they're not transported there. They are essentially what they would have been like if they would have been born and raised in that environment. So they're like alter egos of our Coleridge and Robard in this universe. I'm having a blast. There are a couple essentially Dark Ages mercenaries going around getting into a lot of trouble in a fairy tale setting.
Are you, Laird, telling us right now that there is a type of Glenn Cook, the Black Company version of Robard and Coleridge coming up in our near future?
God,
a whole bunch. As a matter of fact, Black companies, because they belong to at one time they're middle-aged guys, especially by Dark Ages standards. They no longer work for the company that they had worked for. And it's a world of mercenary companies, freebooters, and that kind of a thing. And they now are sort of, it's almost like a cross between a Western in some ways, a samurai epic, and then you throw in Carl Edward Wagner in a fantasy fairy tale setting. And just kind of you boil all those things together. And so it's a roundabout way of saying there's going to be a lot more adventures of featuring those two, and quite a few characters from all of my contemporary work.
That is so exciting. Your fans are very excited over here.
Right. The chat absolutely exploded when you mentioned that.
Yeah, there's basically like just there's a lot of exclamation points.
So we get from Ethan Pollard. That is unbelievably exciting. I always feel that the overlap of fantasy and horror is severely underexplored. Cathonica says, check our Dark Ages Coleridge and Robard and Uncoiling in the January issue of Cosmic Horror Monthly.
Oh, well.
Oh!
Yeah, that will give you it's interesting. What I'm doing is I'm working on a book. And that's how I write short stories. I write short stories with the idea that they'll fit together in a book someday.
Here we go. This is the inside baseball of the Laird Barron library. We're ready.
Yeah, and I'm looking at 2025, something like that, most likely. But I'm over halfway done with it, and basically a third of it's going to be a certain type of dark fantasy. The middle portion of it's going to basically follow the saga of Coleridge and Robard. There's going to be probably about 50,000 words, so like a novel of short stories featuring them exclusively, and then the final a chunk of the book is a science fiction fantasy setting, but it's all the same setting, but it's just different time periods, and it all kind of ties together in a big old mosaic novel. And I'm having a blast.
That's so exciting.
It. But if you read the Uncoiling story in Cosmic Horror Monthly, that'll give you a good taste of what that particular, the middle portion of the collection will be like with those two.
That is so cool. Thank you for sharing that with us too.
Well, and a shout out to the folks over at Cosmic Horror Monthly. I really enjoyed working with them.
Very cool. Did you see anything else in there, Seth?
So there's a couple of things in here that are exciting to say. We have so Paul Preston. I'm going to get back to you, Paul. Thank you again so much for joining us. He says that it made such a different take on noir from what I have read. It is so typically from the PI point of view, also a great take to have an intelligent heavy versus the dumb jock cliche. Speaking of dumb jocks, I have to ask about this because we don't have any questions. Why does Isaiah take Meg? Or I guess I should ask, does Isaiah know that when he takes Meg out on their first date, that there are going to be people who are connected at that club? And if so, is Isaiah so like confident that he's not going to allow anything to happen? The reason that he takes her there?
That's a good question.
No, actually, I thought about that quite a bit. Basically, he didn't feel any danger to himself or Meg in the sense that they're going to get whacked. He wouldn't have taken her. The bigger risk to him would have been to have horrified her if violence did break out, but he had no way of knowing that was what was going to happen either. He's very, when it comes, he knows the dance. In other words, he knew that something would be requested of him, or he may have to pay some sort of price, but he didn't know what it was going to be. But in my mind, he didn't think they were going to get taken out behind the restaurant and dumped in the river, nothing like that.
Right.
But having to, man-to-man combat, sort of almost semi-execution that he was, or beating he was called upon, it did occur to him, and I can't remember how I expressed it in the story, but in my thinking, I know a lot more about Coleridge now. It bothered him that might happen, but he also felt like she needs to see that side of him. He for him, it was very romantic. It was love at first sight,
right?
Basically, he's a moosh, and it was love at first sight, lust, love. But he fell in love with her almost instantly. And I think, knowing a lot of tough guys over the years of a certain persuasion, sometimes some people are liars, and they just will put on that I'll live a dual life for as long as I can. And there are other people they may not be good people, but they're more forthright and they're going, no, this is who I am. Either you're on board with me or you're not. And for me, that actually comes from true crime and personal experiences with different people than it does from as much as it comes from emulating fiction. Because I'm like, what would, once again, this is a fantasy, but let's inject a little reality. What are the stakes here? What are the consequences? What are the different options that he has? And I'm saying, that was one of them is basically he's off to do business. Also, it's a power move on his part.
Right.
Because you don't show up he's not just a leg breaker. He was groomed and trained, and he was like this perfect, like not quite, maybe a Renaissance man, even according to, his boss, that I see something in this guy. He's not just a goon. We can send him out. He looks great, but he cleans up. He cleans up well. He speaks well. He's highly intelligent, a little bit sarcastic. We can use him for high level things. He's the guy that normally we don't want to get into this, but he's the guy that snaps his fingers. Coleridge is, and would have 4 goons go beat up the guy while he's smoking a cigarette, going, okay.
Right.
He's graduated from doing a lot of that. So when he beats up this guy at the nightclub, it is almost not quite a slap in his face, but it's him rolling up his sleeves, going, I can still do this. I am still a terror. And but he takes Meg with him partially as a power move. He shows up with a beautiful woman, drop of the hat. I've got a woman on the line. I'll bring a woman. So it's another aspect of Coleridge. It isn't the nicest thing in the world.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because just to piggyback off of what Seth said, I mean, the first date, yeah. But I mean, also she could be used as leverage later. I mean, to get to him, and she has a child. So the whole time I was pretty nervous thinking, okay, well, Meg obviously is going into this eyes wide open. Like, she knows what he's kind of all about, but also like he's taking a huge risk. Bringing her into this situation.
Or not thinking it through, or being kind of selfish. And there's a lot of stuff going on here. Part of this is a critique. I like to have my cake and eat it too. Part of it's a critique of the very thing I'm doing. I can't help it. I have to poke, because I'm always like, these guys just do stuff and they never worry about their families. Yeah. They're just like, well, you can't touch my family. So there's a little bit of that. There's a little bit, you aren't gonna, but she's not family. She's a date. But there's a merciless, ruthless nature with Coleridge. And the thing is, it's not a literary novel. So I can't go, all in with just the horrors that would really happen. This isn't about what would really happen. This is something that could never happen, that Laird Barron injects a tiny little bit of real world reality in to kind of leaven it a little, but it's not real. And so what do I do with it? I try to poke at it. I mean, I'm aware of all this stuff throughout the entire series, though. I never want you to be 100% comfortable with the idea that he's Mr. One of the cliches and one of the tropes in popular fiction, whether that's cinema or literature, the ex-bad guy who I used to kill people. I used to be a murdering, raping, pillaging Viking, but they don't ever do it on screen. That's the little scar that they bear, and all the girls go, oh, he's so... No, this guy was a bad guy. He probably has snapped some woman's arm. He probably has, right? He has his... I mean, he's not 100% vile, evil, horrible, because he obviously wants to get away from it. But it comes up over and over again. We can never, he and Robards will discuss this, we'll never be 100% free of what we've done. And that's not just lip service. That is, I can only go so far in a commercial series because he's supposed to be a hero to some degree.
Sure.
But, and I'm not necessarily even trying to cast judgment. I'm just saying, you get really comfortable with the first person narrative where the person says, hey, I'm a reformed dude, I'm fine. And yet does these questionable things, and that will continue.
Ooh, what a good way to lead into setting everybody up for the future books that we're going to get into together.
Black Mountain,
which Seth already started, so I'm sure other people did too. So we'll set up a group chat for that.
It's very, very, very exciting. So I did want to get Cathonica has a really, really good question. I think folks will be interested in it. They say, you've spoken at length about the Japanese filmmaker Takaishi Miike. And are his films and characters an influence specifically on Coleridge? Miike's stuff is pretty bizarre.
Yes, definitely. And more so in some of my shorter fiction where I just let my freak flag fly. But here's the deal. And I'm not unique in this regard. Just because something's hugely influential upon you as a writer doesn't necessarily mean that the audience is going to see that. Go, oh, I can point to that. There's the Miike influence, but it is there in Coleridge. There's a lot of more obvious influences. Just they even tell you they like Frazetta, they like Conan stories, they like westerns. He loves Humphrey Bogart, etc. But as far as what influences me, like how some of the filter is it's always. Miike is always in there. I really admire his work.
Who couldn't? Absolutely tremendous. So we are wrapping up here on time. So if anyone has another question they want to get in before we're all done here, definitely drop that into the chat.
Paul had a question.
Let's see. What did Paul say? I may have missed it.
He wanted to know, I can't quite see it, about Reba at 817. I'm just trying to explain. Did you know what happened to Reba before you wrote it?
Okay. Yeah. Tell us that.
Yes.
Boom.
Boom. There it is.
Right. And the reason that I chose to do it the way that I did it, there's so many different. I actually toyed with keeping her around because I was interested possibly in developing her kind of brother sister relationship with Robard, because Robard became far more important. Lionel became far more important immediately. I never predicted that he would be as important. But yeah, but I said, no, this is what I'm going to do. It's a failure for Coleridge and it will haunt him. He looks at it as and Robard does too, but Robard handles it differently. We're not in Robard's head. So we don't know what Robard's thinking. He drinks a lot and maybe he drinks more, but for Isaiah, this is I said earlier, that the character, if it's a series, that character, unless you're pulling some kind of a swift one, which I don't think is always fair, at least the main character is going to survive for however many books that you have. Maybe they'll die in the last one, who knows, but they're going to be alive in book 2. So to a certain degree, there's not as much tension. For me, like the combat scenes are not about building tension about what happens to him, whether he lives or dies. Secondary character, sure, just maybe Lionel's going to get it in the neck. We don't know. Or somebody else you like. Maybe Meg and the child really are in some terrible danger. But for Coleridge, it's what for any character that's the pivotal character. If you want to, there's things you take. If you want to cause tension, it's what am I going to take from you? Death's the easiest. That's where, especially for a guy like him, okay, I can rest. No, what am I going to take from you? And loss of honor, failure in general are things that could have an impact on Coleridge, even if something we consider selfish, like your motivations are selfish or your reactions are selfish. It's still nonetheless something that's going to live in his heart. And I thought that was an important. He wins, but he doesn't win. That brute force did not. This is not something that brute force did sort of solve. Created a bunch of problems that had to be solved. It solved some of the other problems that were coming at him with brute force, but it couldn't solve the mystery. It did, but it didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So what a tremendous way to lead us into what will be our next read along, which is the second book in the series, Black Mountain, which, yes, I went ahead and started. So everyone, please don't be too upset with me. But I want to throw it over to Sadie, our gracious host, who has done such a tremendous job. Sadie, would you like to provide us with our salutation?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for hanging out with us tonight. Like, it wouldn't be as fun if you weren't over there chatting and interacting with us. The group chat is literally, I talk about you guys all the time because I've been in so many read-alongs where people just don't interact or they don't keep up with the books or it just kind of peters out. And you guys have been amazing over there, keeping it going, keeping the momentum going, keeping the excitement going and the discussion. So I really just want to thank you for showing up tonight, showing up to the group chat. I'm excited to start Black Mountain. We're going to have Laird back with us for another discussion when we finish that book. So what a treat to be able to sit with you tonight, Laird, and pick your brain and have all this insight. Like, we really, truly appreciate you. This will have playback, so I'm going to get this uploaded to YouTube, and people who missed out will be able to watch it later. So we just want to thank you for showing up for us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you too for organizing this and putting it on, and thank you for everybody who's been doing the read along, and also I really appreciate the questions, the interaction.
It is our treat. We want to thank everybody for showing up in the chat, and do not miss your chance to hit Black Mountain. We haven't established a date yet for when we'll be doing the discussion with Laird, but we will be doing it sooner than you think.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All righty. You guys enjoy the rest of your night. You three can stick around for just a second, and I'm going to end this broadcast. So good night, everyone.
Good night.